There are moments in war when the survival of hundreds depends on the actions of one man in a span of time shorter than it takes to cook breakfast. This is the story of 36 minutes before dawn on May 11th, 1945, when a single rifleman stood between nearly 200 American soldiers and annihilation. What happened in that brief window at Ding Allen Bay on Luzon was not the product of superhuman courage or reckless heroism. It was something more difficult to explain and harder to replicate. This is a true story about what happens when training, instinct, and the refusal to stop converge in the dark before the sun rises. The jungle at Ding Allen Bay did not sleep. Even in the hours before dawn, it breathed and clicked and rustled with a life that made silence impossible. The air was thick enough to taste, heavy with salt from the bay and rot from the undergrowth, and it clung to skin like warm oil. The darkness was absolute. No moon penetrated the canopy overhead, and the stars were invisible through the layered mass of leaves and vines that turned the night into a solid thing. Company A's perimeter was dug into a low ridge that overlooked the bay, a shallow defensive arc cut into the jungle with foxholes spaced 20 yards apart, and fields of fire that existed more in theory than in practice. The men had been awake for most of the night. Sleep was rationed like ammunition, taken in shifts, always incomplete. Exhaustion was a constant companion by May of 1945, a weight that pressed down on the shoulders and made every movement slower, every decision harder. They had been fighting for months, island to island, jungle to jungle, and the war had become a rhythm of digging in, waiting, fighting, moving, and digging in again. Ding Allen Bay was supposed to be a rest area. It was not. Private First Class John McKinley had the last watch before dawn. He sat in his foxhole with his M1 Garand resting across his knees, his hands loose on the wood and metal, his eyes scanning the black wall of jungle 20 yards ahead. The M1 was a good rifle. It fired 8 rounds of .30-06 ammunition from an en-bloc clip that ejected with a distinctive metallic ping when empty, and it was accurate, reliable, and fast. McKinley had fired thousands of rounds through his M1 in training and combat, and he knew its weight and balance the way a carpenter knows a hammer. He could reload it in the dark without looking, his fingers finding the clip, pressing it down into the receiver, hearing the bolt snap forward to chamber the first round. He had done it so many times that the action had become automatic, a sequence of movements that required no thought. That automaticity would matter in the minutes ahead. The jungle was never quiet, but there was a quality to the sounds that changed in the hour before dawn. The insects grew louder. The rustling of small animals in the undergrowth became more frequent. The air cooled slightly, just enough to be felt on the face and hands. McKinley listened to these changes and tried to separate them from the sounds that did not belong. He was not thinking about heroism or survival. He was thinking about staying awake. His eyelids were heavy and his body wanted nothing more than to sleep, but he kept his eyes open and his ears tuned to the darkness. The other men in the foxholes to his left and right were quiet. Some were asleep. Some were awake and waiting. None of them spoke. There was nothing to say. At 04:30 hours, McKinley heard something that did not fit. It was a soft sound, almost lost in the ambient noise of the jungle, but it was deliberate, metal on metal, a weapon being shifted, a canteen brushing against a belt. It came from the jungle directly ahead of his position, no more than 30 yards out, and it was followed by another sound, this one unmistakable. The rustle of cloth against leaves. Movement. Multiple sources. He did not move. He kept his eyes fixed on the darkness and his breathing slow and quiet. His hand tightened on the rifle. He did not call out. He did not fire. He waited. The sounds grew closer. 25 yards. 20. He could hear breathing now, low and controlled, and the faint scrape of boots on roots. They were coming in quietly, trying to close the distance before they were detected. It was a classic dawn assault. Hit the perimeter before first light, before the defenders could see, and overwhelm them with speed and numbers. McKinley had seen it before. He knew what was about to happen. He raised the M1 to his shoulder and aimed at the source of the closest sound. He could not see a target. The jungle was too dark, but he knew where the sound was coming from and he knew how to shoot at a sound. He exhaled slowly, let his body settle, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked and kicked into his shoulder, the muzzle flash lighting up the jungle for a fraction of a second, and in that brief flare of light he saw them. Shadows moving between the trees, dozens of them, maybe more. The flash faded and the darkness returned, but McKinley had seen enough. He fired again, working the trigger as fast as he could aim, not at specific targets but at the movement, at the mass of shapes pushing through the undergrowth. The M1 barked and flashed, and with each shot the jungle lit up for an instant, revealing more soldiers, closer now, running. The other men in the perimeter woke to the sound of gunfire and began to shoot. The line erupted. Rifles cracked and stuttered, muzzle flashes flickering like fireflies, and the jungle came alive with the sound of bullets tearing through leaves and thudding into trees. The Japanese assault was not a wave. It was a coordinated push along multiple points of the perimeter, designed to find weak spots and exploit them. McKinley could hear firing to his left and right, but the heaviest concentration was directly ahead, and it was growing. The shapes in the jungle were not retreating. They were advancing. He fired his 8th round, and the clip ejected with its signature ping, spinning away into the darkness. His hands moved without thought. He pulled a fresh clip from his belt, pressed it down into the receiver, felt the bolt slam forward, and brought the rifle back up. The entire reload took less than 3 seconds. He fired again. The man in the foxhole to his right was firing in short, controlled bursts, but the man to his left had stopped. McKinley did not know if he was reloading, wounded, or dead. He did not have time to check. He kept shooting. The machine gun position was 30 yards to his left, dug in behind a fallen log with overlapping fields of fire that covered the center of the perimeter. It was the anchor of the defense, and it had been firing steadily since the attack began, the heavy chatter of the Browning M1919 cutting through the lighter crackle of rifle fire. Then it stopped. The silence was immediate and terrifying. Without the machine gun, the center of the line was vulnerable. McKinley heard shouting from that direction, voices raised in panic or pain, and he knew what it meant. The gun was down. He did not hesitate. He rolled out of his foxhole, staying low, and moved left at a crouch, his rifle up and ready. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and rocks, and he stumbled twice but did not fall. He could hear movement ahead of him, closer than it should have been, and he fired from the hip at a shadow that materialized between the trees. The shadow dropped. He kept moving. The machine gun position was chaos. The gunner was slumped over the weapon, his head at an unnatural angle, and the assistant gunner was trying to clear a jam, his hands shaking, his face pale in the dim light. 2 other soldiers were firing rifles from behind the log, but they were shooting blind, spraying bullets into the jungle without aiming. McKinley dropped into the position and grabbed the assistant gunner by the shoulder. The man flinched and turned, his eyes wide. McKinley did not speak. He pushed the man aside, grabbed the machine gun, and pulled back the charging handle. The jam was a double feed, 2 rounds trying to enter the chamber at once. He cleared it in seconds, his fingers working by feel, and slammed a fresh belt into the feed tray. He pulled the charging handle again, heard the bolt lock into place, and pressed the trigger. The gun roared to life, the barrel jerking as it spat rounds into the jungle at 600 rounds per minute. The recoil shook the log and the noise was deafening, but McKinley kept the trigger down, sweeping the barrel left and right, walking the fire across the tree line where he knew the attackers were massing. He could see them now in the muzzle flashes, figures running and falling, and he kept firing until the belt ran dry. He released the trigger and the gun fell silent. His ears were ringing and his hands were numb from the vibration. The assistant gunner had disappeared. The 2 riflemen were still firing, but their movements were mechanical, born of panic rather than discipline. McKinley reached for another belt of ammunition and found none. The ammunition box was empty. He looked around the position and saw 3 more boxes stacked behind the log, but one had been hit by a bullet and the ammunition inside was scattered and useless. He grabbed the second box, ripped it open, and fed the belt into the gun. His hands were steady. He did not think about the dead gunner or the missing assistant or the fact that he was now responsible for keeping the machine gun operational. He simply did what needed to be done. He charged the gun and fired again, this time in shorter bursts, conserving ammunition and controlling the barrel. The jungle lit up with each burst, and he could see the assault beginning to falter. The attackers were taking cover, regrouping, and the forward momentum had stalled. But the attack was not over. McKinley heard firing from the right side of the perimeter, heavier now, and he realized that the Japanese were shifting their focus, probing for another weak point. He could not stay at the machine gun. The position was secure for the moment, but the right flank was collapsing. He turned to one of the riflemen, a young private whose name he did not know, and shouted over the noise. The private looked at him with blank eyes. McKinley grabbed the man by the front of his shirt and pulled him close, speaking directly into his ear. He told him to take the machine gun and keep firing short bursts at anything that moved. He told him not to stop. The private nodded, his face slack with fear, but he moved to the gun and took hold of the grips. McKinley did not wait to see if the man would follow through. He grabbed his M1, checked the clip, and moved right. The right flank was 30 yards away, and the ground between was open, a narrow strip of cleared earth that offered no cover. McKinley ran. He did not think about the bullets that might be coming his way or the fact that he was silhouetted against the faint glow of muzzle flashes. He ran because the alternative was to let the line break. He reached the first foxhole on the right and dropped into it. The soldier inside was firing steadily, his movements calm and controlled, but he was alone. The foxholes on either side were empty. McKinley did not know where the men had gone. He did not ask. He took up a position at the edge of the hole and began firing at the shapes moving through the jungle. The M1 kicked against his shoulder with each shot, and the brass casings ejected in bright arcs, spinning away into the darkness. He fired until the clip pinged out, reloaded, and fired again. The soldier next to him glanced over, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, and nodded once. They did not speak. The flanking attack came from the right, where the jungle pressed closest to the perimeter. McKinley saw them before they broke cover, a tight group of soldiers moving fast and low, trying to slip around the edge of the line and come in from behind. They were 20 yards out when he opened fire. The first man went down immediately. The second stumbled and fell. The rest scattered, diving into the undergrowth, and McKinley shifted his aim, firing at the places where he thought they were hiding. The soldier next to him was firing as well, and together they poured rounds into the jungle, forcing the attackers to stay down. But ammunition was running low. McKinley had 3 clips left on his belt, 24 rounds, and he did not know when he would be able to resupply. He had to make every shot count. A mortar round hit 15 yards behind the foxhole. The explosion, a white-hot flash that threw dirt and debris into the air and left his ears ringing worse than before. The concussion wave slapped him like a physical blow, and he felt the air driven from his lungs. He gasped and shook his head, trying to clear the fog that had descended over his thoughts. The soldier next to him was screaming, but McKinley could not hear the words. He looked over and saw that the man's face was covered in blood, a piece of shrapnel embedded in his cheek. The man was still firing, working the bolt of his rifle with one hand while the other pressed against the wound. McKinley turned back to the jungle and kept shooting. Another mortar round hit, this one closer, and the explosion threw him against the side of the foxhole. His rifle flew from his hands and landed in the dirt 3 feet away. He scrambled for it, his fingers clawing at the earth, and grabbed it by the barrel. He pulled it back, checked that the action was clear, and brought it to his shoulder. The jungle was spinning. His vision was blurred and his head throbbed with a deep, nauseating pain. He blinked hard and forced his eyes to focus. The shapes were still there, still moving, and he fired at them. The soldier next to him stopped firing. McKinley glanced over and saw that the man had slumped forward, his rifle resting across the edge of the foxhole, his eyes open but unseeing. McKinley did not check for a pulse. He knew. He reached over and took the man's ammunition, 4 clips, and added them to his own belt. He now had 7 clips, 56 rounds. He would use them all before the sun rose. The attack intensified. The Japanese were pushing hard now, throwing everything they had at the perimeter in a final attempt to break through before dawn. McKinley could hear grenades exploding to his left, the sharp crack of fragmenting metal, and the screams of men hit by shrapnel. He could hear shouting in Japanese, close enough that he could make out individual voices, and he knew that they were almost on top of the line. He climbed out of the foxhole and moved forward, not back. He went toward the sound of the grenades, toward the place where the line was weakest, and he fired as he moved. The M1 barked and kicked, and he did not stop to see if he hit anything. He just kept moving and shooting, trusting that his rounds were finding targets, trusting that his presence would be enough to slow the advance. He reached a section of the perimeter that had been completely overrun. 3 foxholes were empty, the soldiers who had occupied them either dead or driven back, and Japanese soldiers were moving through the positions, consolidating their hold. McKinley dropped to one knee and opened fire. He shot the nearest soldier in the back, then swung his aim to the next, then the next. He fired as fast as he could work the trigger, not aiming carefully but pointing and shooting, relying on instinct and repetition. The clip pinged out and he reloaded, his hands moving in the familiar rhythm, and he kept firing. A soldier turned toward him, raising a rifle, and McKinley shot him in the chest before the man could aim. Another soldier appeared from behind a tree, bayonet fixed, and McKinley shot him twice, the rounds hitting center mass and dropping him like a stone. The fighting was close now, close enough to see faces, and McKinley did not let himself think about the fact that he was killing men at a range where he could see their eyes. He just kept pulling the trigger. A grenade landed 3 feet to his right. He saw it hit the ground and roll, and he had less than 2 seconds to react. He threw himself backward, rolling away from the explosive, and the grenade detonated with a sharp crack that sent fragments screaming through the air. Something hot sliced across his left arm, and he felt the wetness of blood soaking into his sleeve. The pain was immediate and bright, but it was manageable. He ignored it. He rolled onto his stomach, brought the rifle up, and fired at the soldier who had thrown the grenade. The man was reloading, pulling another grenade from his belt, and McKinley shot him before he could throw it. The soldier fell, and the grenade dropped from his hand and exploded where he lay. McKinley turned away from the blast and kept moving. He retook the first foxhole, then the second, firing into the jungle and forcing the attackers back. He could not hold the positions alone, but he did not need to hold them. He just needed to disrupt the advance long enough for the line to stabilize. He moved to the third foxhole and found it occupied by 2 American soldiers who had returned after being driven out. They were firing steadily, and when they saw McKinley, they shouted something he could not hear over the noise. He dropped into the hole with them and added his fire to theirs. Together they poured rounds into the jungle, and the attack began to crumble. The Japanese soldiers were falling back, retreating into the trees, and the volume of incoming fire was decreasing. McKinley fired his last clip, the M1 pinging empty, and he reached for his belt and found nothing. He was out of ammunition. He looked at the 2 soldiers next to him and gestured at his rifle. One of them handed him 2 clips without a word. McKinley loaded one and put the other on his belt. He had 16 rounds left. He would make them count. Sky was beginning to light. It was not dawn yet, but the absolute blackness of night was giving way to a deep gray, and the shapes in the jungle were becoming more distinct. McKinley could see individual trees now, and the undergrowth, and the bodies scattered on the ground between the perimeter and the tree line. There were dozens of them, some moving, some still. The firing had slowed to sporadic bursts, and the sound of voices shouting in Japanese was fading. The attack was over. The perimeter had held. McKinley stayed in the foxhole and watched the jungle. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining from his system and leaving him weak and cold. His left arm throbbed where the shrapnel had cut him, and his head ached from the mortar blasts. His ears were still ringing, a high-pitched whine that made it difficult to hear anything else. He was exhausted. He wanted to close his eyes and sleep, but he forced himself to stay alert. The Japanese could still launch another attack. They could be regrouping in the jungle, preparing for a second push. He could not let his guard down. Not yet. Sun rose slowly, the light filtering through the canopy in pale shafts that illuminated the carnage. McKinley counted 40 bodies in front of the perimeter, and he knew there were more deeper in the jungle, where the machine gun fire had cut them down before they reached the line. The foxholes were filled with empty brass casings, and the air smelled of cordite and blood and the sharp, coppery tang of spent ammunition. The soldiers around him were silent. Some were tending to wounds. Some were staring at the jungle. Some were crying. McKinley sat in the foxhole and looked at his hands. They were black with powder residue and streaked with blood, some his and some not. He did not remember getting hit. He did not remember much of anything after the first few minutes. It had all blurred together into a continuous sequence of movement and noise and the mechanical action of reloading and firing. An officer appeared at the edge of the foxhole, a lieutenant whose face was pale and drawn. He looked down at McKinley and said something, but McKinley could not hear him over the ringing in his ears. The lieutenant repeated himself, louder this time, and McKinley understood. The lieutenant was asking if he was all right. McKinley nodded. He was not all right, but he was alive, and that was enough. The lieutenant moved on, checking the other positions, and McKinley climbed out of the foxhole. His legs were unsteady, and he had to brace himself against the side to keep from falling. He looked around at the perimeter and saw that nearly every position had been reinforced. Men were digging in deeper, stringing wire, preparing for the next attack. But McKinley knew there would not be another attack. The Japanese had committed everything they had, and they had failed. The perimeter was secure. He walked back to his original foxhole and sat down. His M1 was still there, lying in the dirt where he had left it. He picked it up and checked the action. It was fouled with dirt and powder residue, and it would need to be cleaned before it could be fired again. He set it across his knees and leaned back against the wall of the foxhole. The sun was fully up now, and the jungle was bright and green and alive. Birds were calling in the canopy, and the insects had resumed their constant hum. It was as if the last 36 minutes had not happened, but they had. The bodies were proof of that. The blood on his hands was proof of that. The silence of the men around him was proof of that. McKinley did not speak about those 36 minutes for the rest of the day. He did not speak about them for the rest of the week. When the company moved out 2 days later, he packed his gear and followed, and he did not look back at the perimeter or the jungle or the place where he had spent half an hour fighting for his life and the lives of the men around him. The war continued. There were more islands, more jungles, more battles. McKinley fought in all of them, and he did his job, and he survived. When the war ended and he returned home, he put his uniform in a closet and went back to work. He married and had children and lived a quiet life. He did not talk about the war. When people asked, he said it was over and he did not want to think about it anymore. His family respected that. His friends respected that. The world moved on. In 1946, a letter arrived at his home. It was from the United States Army, and it informed him that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Ding Allen Bay on May 11th, 1945. The citation described how he had single-handedly disrupted a coordinated enemy assault, eliminated multiple enemy soldiers, maintained a critical machine gun position under fire, repelled a flanking maneuver, and counterattacked collapsing sections of the defensive line despite wounds and exhaustion. It said that his actions had saved the lives of nearly 200 men. McKinley read the letter once and put it in a drawer. He attended the ceremony because he was told it was his duty, and he accepted the medal because he was told it would honor the men who had not come home. But he did not wear the medal. He did not display it. He did not talk about it. It went into the drawer with the letter, and it stayed there. Years later, a journalist asked him what he remembered about those 36 minutes. McKinley was an old man by then, his hair gray and his hands gnarled with arthritis, and he thought about the question for a long time before he answered. He said he remembered the sound of the M1 ejecting the empty clip. He said he remembered the weight of the machine gun and the way it shook when it fired. He said he remembered the smell of the jungle and the way the darkness felt like a living thing pressing in from all sides. He said he did not remember feeling afraid. He said he did not remember feeling brave. He said he just remembered doing what needed to be done, one action after another, until the sun came up and it was over. The journalist asked if he thought he was a hero. McKinley said no. He said the heroes were the men who did not come home. He said he was just a soldier who did his job. The journalist wrote the story anyway, and it was published in a magazine that McKinley never read. McKinley died in 1987 at the age of 63. His funeral was attended by family and friends, and a representative from the veterans of foreign wars who presented a folded flag to his widow. The Medal of Honor was mentioned in the eulogy, but only briefly. The people who knew him did not remember him for the medal. They remembered him as a quiet man who worked hard, loved his family, and never complained. They remembered him as someone who had lived through something terrible and had carried it with dignity and silence. They did not know the details of what had happened at Ding Allen Bay. They did not know about the machine gun or the flanking attack or the mortar blasts. They did not know that for 36 minutes in the dark before dawn, he had been the only thing standing between survival and annihilation, and McKinley would have wanted it that way. The story of what happened at Ding Allen Bay is not a story about glory. It is a story about necessity. It is a story about what happens when there is no time to think and no room for doubt and no option except to move forward and keep fighting. It is a story about the cost of survival and the weight of memory, and the way that history is often decided not by grand strategies or bold leadership, but by the actions of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. It is a story about 36 minutes that changed the course of 200 lives, and about one man who spent the rest of his life trying to forget them. The perimeter at Ding Allen Bay held because Private First Class John McKinley did not stop. He did not stop when the machine gun went down. He did not stop when he ran out of ammunition. He did not stop when the mortars hit, or when the shrapnel cut his arm, or when the men around him fell. He kept moving and kept shooting and kept fighting because there was no alternative. And when the sun rose and the attack was over, he did what soldiers do. He cleaned his rifle, checked his gear, and prepared for the next battle. He did not ask for recognition. He did not seek praise. He simply did his job, and in doing so, he saved nearly 200 lives. War is not a story. It is a series of moments, brutal and brief, that are survived or not survived. Ding Allen Bay was one of those moments. 36 minutes when everything hung in the balance and the outcome was determined not by numbers or firepower but by the refusal of one man to let the line break. That is the truth of it. That is the lesson of it. And that is why it matters, even now, even decades later, even though the man who lived it never wanted to talk about it. If you found this story powerful, I would be honored if you would subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button if this story moved you or taught you something about the nature of combat and survival. And please, share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to ask you a question that historians and veterans have debated for decades. What truly determines survival in combat? Is it training that makes actions automatic? Is it instinct that takes over when thought becomes impossible? Is it discipline that keeps a soldier moving when everything inside him is screaming to stop? Or is it something else entirely, something we cannot define or replicate or teach? I would love to hear your perspective. Thank you for listening to this story. These moments in history deserve to be remembered, and the men who lived them deserve to be honored. Until next time.